Mayor Tillman, it's so nice to see you again, and also to meet Karen Meredith. It is an honor to be with all of you people deeply committed to peace. I thought I'd start with a joke that my brother Steve sent me, that was shared by his rabbi on High Holy Days. Maybe he's here too, I don't know. It is a true story. Commander Horatio Hornblower was on the deck of his ship and saw a light ahead. This is the exchange that followed. Boat number 1 to approaching light. We are on a collision course. Turn your boat 10 degrees north. Light signals back. Yes, you are on a collision course. Please turn your boat 10 degrees south. Boat 1 signals again. I'm an admiral. I'm commanding you to turn your boat 10 degrees north. Light flashes back immediately. I'm a seaman second class, and I'm telling you to turn your boat 10 degrees south. The admiral is furious. He flashes back. I repeat, I'm a Navy admiral, and you're hereby ordered to turn your boat 10 degrees north. I am in a battleship. Light returns a signal, and I am commanding you to turn your boat 10 degrees south. I am in a lighthouse. So much for hierarchy. Well, it is a great honor to be here and to be on this 100-city tour. I thank Dennis Moynihan, without whom this book would not be possible, and without whom this tour would not be possible, although sometimes I wonder whether that is such. No, it is great to be here. We're at around city 60, 65, I'm not sure what it is, I can't remember, but I was very proud when I said this to someone the other day, and they said, oh, you mean you only have 35 cities to go? I thought that was a very negative comment. But it has been an amazing journey. We started in right after the Republican Convention in Sarasota, celebrating a small community radio station, WSLR. We were about 20 minutes late to that one, and I said, oh my gosh, by that count, the 100th city will be months late. But we actually came here early. As you know, I come originally from Pacifica Radio, which was founded more than 60 years ago by a war resister who came out of the detention camps after World War II. His name was Lou Hill, and said there has to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists, and that's how Pacifica was born. The first Pacifica station, KPFA, in the Bay Area, 1949. Not run by corporations, as George Gervner, the late dean in the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. The second Pacifica station, KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. 1960, my station in New York, WBAI. 1977, WPFW in Washington. 1970, KPFT in Houston. And that's the station. That's the only station in the country whose transmitter was blown up, blown to smithereens by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up in the first weeks of operation. And when KPFT got back on its feet, I mean, the silver lining was it wasn't as if Pacific had money to advertise their new station. It certainly blew it into the potential listening audience of the people of the Petro Metro. And when they got their, back on their feet and they started broadcasting again, right in the middle of Orlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, they blew it up again. And I don't know if it was the Grand Dragon, the Exalted Cyclops, or the Imperial Wizard, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an Afghan aunt or an Iraqi uncle, you say, that sounds like my bubba or my baby, my aunt, my uncle. And it begins to break down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war. In this 100-city tour, let's see, we were in Denver, right down the road from the first presidential debate that night. We were in a Comcast facility in Littleton, Colorado. And we checked the images online that day, the workers who were setting up the presidential debate. And we saw what the podiums looked like and the blue screen behind them. And so we went out and rented 2 podiums that looked like theirs and had a blue screen that said Democracy Now! Behind it. Invited in the 2 presidential candidates, Jill Stein of the Green Party, Rocky Anderson, the former mayor of Salt Lake City of the Justice Party. Had them stand just like the presidential candidates, Mitt Romney and President Obama were standing. And we started the debate as they did with Jim Lehrer, who was the moderator of the first debate. He asked the questions of Romney and Obama. Started with President Obama, said you have 2 minutes on the economy. When he was done, 2 minutes, Mitt Romney, and then we paused the videotape. And we said 2 minutes, Dr. Jill Stein, on the economy. And then to Rocky Anderson, you have 2 minutes on the economy. And then back to my colleague Jim Lehrer at the University of Denver. We broke the sound barrier. We brought in these different voices. This is what democracy sounds like. Now, how is it that the debates have come to take the form they have? You know that for decades, the presidential debates were run by the League of Women Voters. What happened? In the 1980s, the main political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, got fed up with the ladies controlling the debates, the League of Women Voters. And they handed the League a 21-page secret contract to sign. And the League said no. And they not only said no, but they held a news conference and released the contract to the press. And that was it. The 2 parties took over. The head of the Republican Party at the time, Frank Fahrenkopf, he still heads the Republican side. The head of the Democratic side now is Mike McCurry, the former press spokesperson for President Bill Clinton. He's a major lobbyist for telecoms now. And, well, this is a very good bet for the 2 major parties, and that's something Frank Fahrenkopf appreciates because he is the executive director of the American Gaming Association. He's the chief lobbyist for gambling in this country. They're the ones who run this debate. You think it's sort of an independent body, the Commission on Presidential Debates, or a governmental body. It's a private corporation funded by Anheuser-Busch, International Bottled Water Association. So when we were setting up our debate podiums to look just like theirs, we weren't sure, should we put Bud Light on the platform for each of them, or should we put bottled water? We weren't sure. But it matters, because these debates are seen by tens of millions of people. It's not as much about who you vote for, but it's about having a discussion about the critical issues of the day and bringing out the full diversity of opinion. It's very important. And it's very important also that the media do its job in asking questions. For example, the Brady Center Against Gun Violence, started by Jim Brady, who was shot in the head when the attempted assassination of President Reagan took place. Jim and his wife, Sarah Brady, started the Brady campaign against gun violence. They pushed for Jim Lehrer to ask a question about gun violence. After all, the first debate was in Colorado, the Aurora massacre just a few months before, and of course Columbine. That didn't happen. They were asked about gun violence, which goes to the whole issue of the power of the NRA, not by a presidential moderator, a debate moderator, but in the town hall out at Hofstra in Long Island. One of the people asked a question. And we went from that debate to, I was invited into Al Jazeera English's studios to have a debate with David Weston. He is the former president of ABC World News Tonight, to talk about coverage of the elections and coverage of war. And David Weston said that the media does a very good job in covering the full diversity of opinion, and And I said, I beg to differ. And used the example of the lead up to the war in Iraq. The study that was done 6 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, that was March 19, 2003. 2 weeks around February 5th, 2003, that day that then General Colin Powell, Secretary of State, gave his push for war at the United Nations. He'd been seen as a very credible Secretary of State, really holding back on war, not believing perhaps the evidence was all in on weapons of mass destruction. So when he said that the evidence was in, that convinced many people. February 5th, 2003, the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting did a study of the 2 weeks on either side of that speech. And they looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts: NBC Nightly News, CBS Evening News, PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and David Weston's outfit, the ABC World News Tonight. There were 393 interviews done around war in that 2-week period. This is at a time when half the population was opposed to war. Guess how many of those 393 interviews were with anti-war leaders? 3. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war, I said to David Weston. And he said, it may surprise you to know, Amy, that I agree with you. And I was very surprised. And he said he will forever regret that Peter Jennings, you know, who was the anchor of the ABC News, died from cancer, that he had grave misgivings about the whole argument of whether he didn't believe the WMD argument. But David Weston said, I pushed back. I made him hold back. He said, I was under a lot of pressure. Just an interesting fact. We need a media that tells the truth. You know, the private corporations that run the networks, they may be private corporations, but they are using a national treasure that is the public airwaves, and they have an obligation to bring out the full diversity of opinion, or they should have their licenses revoked. So, going back again to World War II, one of the places that we broadcast from in this tour was Los Alamos. Truly amazing. We were broadcasting from Fuller Lodge. That was built in 1928 to be an elite boys' school, and a very disgruntled Gore Vidal went there and hated it. 1943, the US government took it over for the Manhattan Project, the top secret project to develop the atomic bombs. And the first scientists lived at Fuller Lodge, where we broadcast from. That day, we brought on a young Navajo woman who represented the Eastern Diné people, the Navajo, deeply concerned about the uranium tailings and the uranium mines that they now have to live with, that are poisoning them on their reservations. And we brought on a Los Alamos whistleblower, and we brought on a most remarkable figure, Mike Reynolds. How many of you heard this interview with Earthship.com founder? We were driving from Durango to Taos. We were a few minutes early to get to our event in Taos, so we thought, oh, okay, a few minutes. We could take a moment, because we were driving along the road, and there were all these houses, a community of houses built into the earth. And they were built with soda cans, recycled bottles, and rubber tires were the back, packed with earth, which keeps in the heat in the winter and the cold in the summer. And this wild guy with his white hair flying, who was usually not there, was instructing a carpenter how to build a particular house. And he happened to be this guy, Mike Reynolds, who was considered a lunatic 20 years ago, then a heretic 10 years ago. He lost his architect's license because he said he had pipes of sewage going under the living room, because that's what would feed the jungle in the dining room. And he took us through these houses that were truly amazing and magnificent. He said, if anyone has to pay more than $100 in utilities a year, we pay it, because they'll never have to pay more than $10. And when I asked him, why do you do this? So he lost his architect's license, so now he calls himself a biotech. And he went from being considered, to say the least, someone very odd, to getting hundreds of acres on the side of the road in New Mexico, and given $500,000 by the former governor of New Mexico, Governor Richardson, to continue to do this building. When I said to him, why are you doing this? And especially, it's just down the road from Los Alamos. He said, if all of the soldiers and all of the armies and all of the world were to pick up hammers and build sustainable houses, we would no longer have war in the world that is fueled by the hunger for oil and fossil fuels. And he is now traveling the world. He can't keep up with the demand for these houses around the world. That is the positive alternative to what we saw at Los Alamos. But when we were there, I thought about Secretary of War Henry Stimson in World War II, who was handed a list of bombing targets of Japanese cities to choose which cities to destroy. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, and he crossed out Kyoto. He said no. He said, because he and Mrs. Stimson had visited Kyoto, it was a beautiful city. The food was delicious, the people wonderful, the art magnificent. He didn't want to destroy it. The point is so profound. I mean, if only the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been lucky enough to host the Stimsons. But his point was, we know this city. And that's the power of media. How do we learn about the rest of the world? Through our families and maybe someone who lives in another place that we know, but mainly, overwhelmingly, we know about other places through the media. And that's why it is so important we learn about the world through something other than a corporate lens. And equally, and maybe more important, especially for our national security, that the rest of the world learn about us, not through a lens that's brought to you by the weapons manufacturers when we're talking about war, not by a lens that's brought to you by the insurance companies and big pharma, the drug companies when we're talking about healthcare, not by a lens that's brought to you by the nuclear, the oil, the gas, the coal companies when we're talking about climate change. If only the presidential candidates would talk about climate change. 3 major presidential debates, and not once did they talk about climate change. But if only the rest of the world saw us through an independent lens and an independent microphone. Yes. I really do think that the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. That's why stations like KPFA and KCRB and KRCB and KQED are so important. And I also think it's why Democracy Now! Has grown so much. In this last 16 years, we started on a few dozen community radio stations in 1996, the only daily election show in public broadcasting, and now we're broadcasting on over 1,100 public television and radio stations here on KRCB Radio, KRCB Public Television, also on KQED Public Television a number of times a day, and of course on KPFA and many public access TV stations. It is such an honor because people are hungry for independent, authentic voices, digging for the truth. So I want to talk a little about the Republican and Democratic conventions. We went down to Tampa. Dennis mentioned Congressman Akin and his race for the Senate in Missouri. When we were going down, it looked like the hurricane might wipe out the whole convention, and my colleague at Democracy Now!, Steve Martinez, said, "Is it a legitimate hurricane?" So Julie Crosby, our general manager, said, "Because if it is, Tampa will shut down. You don't have to worry, we won't let any water in." So we headed down to Tampa, and we were there to follow the money. You know, this is the first post-Citizens United election. We don't know the billions that are being spent and where that money is coming from. I was speaking in Nevada City the other night, and a guy came up to me after, he said, don't call it Citizens United, call it Corporations United. So my colleague Mike Burke, senior producer at Democracy Now!, went to walk the hallways of the corporate suites above the convention floor. He was with Hani Massoud, our video producer, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound, and he was videoing next to him. And Mike saw Sheldon Adelson, the Vegas casino magnate who has been investigated for corruption and bribery for his building his casinos in Macau and other places, and he promises to give something like $100 million in this election. So Mike went to talk to him about just how much he was going to spend. And before he knew it, the woman standing between Mike and Mr. Adelson stepped back and body slammed Mike, which knocked him off balance. He was totally taken aback. And before Hani knew it, she grabbed Hani's video camera and raced into Adelson's suite. And when he put his foot in the door to reach for his camera, she slammed it on the ground. Mike is then reaching for his Android phone to try to document this somehow, and the Adelson team is trying to rip it out of his hands. I mean, I thought if nothing else, Mr. Adelson respects, even worships private property. But anyway, the next thing they know is top spokesperson for Mr. Adelson comes out of Adelson's suite and says to Mike, hands him his card, says, I'll make you whole, we'll take care of you, just call us tomorrow. We're very sorry about everything that's happened. And Mike said, what are you talking about? Who was that woman? And he said, that would be Mr. Adelson's daughter. And so then Mr. Adelson's daughter came out and apologized twice for what she had done. Now, a lot of people saw this, and we have video of it, and the New York Times did a story, and Politico, even Glenn Beck had it right on his website, what happened, you know, the Adelson family assaulting the Democracy Now! Team. And so they put out a press release the next day, and they are nothing if not well lawyered up, very carefully written. They knew they couldn't say any way Mike had started anything. You know, so many people were walking by, I mean, to pay homage to Mr. Adelson. Karl Rove walked by, Newt Gingrich walked by, they're all going into the Adelson suite. But they put out a press release that said that reporters should be nonviolent, which is something we agree with. And then they wished us well covering the Republican convention. So the next day, I went to speak to one of the delegates in the New York delegation, David Koch. David and Charles Koch are the billionaire oil and gas magnates who funded the Tea Party and promised to give something like $400 million in this election. So I went with John Hamilton, our video producer, and let's just imagine this is like the convention floor. This was Wisconsin over here, back there it's Utah, over here it's the New York delegation, you guys are New Hampshire. So we walked down the aisle, and Mr. Koch is sitting with other New York delegates, and I went over with my microphone and I said, Mr. Koch, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And everyone around him stood up like a stand of aspen trees that grew up in seconds, all of the delegates around him. Now, he is a towering figure, but he was towering behind them, and we tried to get a still from our video as I asked this question to put on our website. The only thing we could get was him looking up with one eye. and so I asked the man who stood up rapidly next to him to protect him from the question. He was Ed Cox. He's the longtime chair of the New York Republican Party, you know, the son-in-law of President Richard Nixon, who's married to Tricia Nixon Cox. And I said, Mr. Cox, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. So the last night of the convention, I was over in New Hampshire interviewing people. And that's when there was a lot of buzz, who's going to be the mystery guest, and then Clint Eastwood comes on the stage, right? And he comes with that empty chair, and he's talking to the invisible Obama. I mean, the racism implicit in that, right? Ralph Ellison is the invisible man. But then he went on to say something about how critics say that President Obama, you know, said he would close Guantanamo, and he hasn't in all of these years. And that's a very legitimate criticism, I think. I just didn't expect to hear it from the stage of the Republican convention. And then he went on to say that the war in Afghanistan is the longest war in U.S. history, and something about Mitt Romney would pull out troops the next morning. I don't think, well, I think that there was no one more surprised to hear that than Mitt Romney. And then Mitt Romney, this was going to be the biggest night of his political life, came from the back, and the music swelled, and he was walking down one of the aisles, and there's thousands of people, and there's lots of aisles, but we were here, and we looked up on the Jumbotron and said, oh my God, he's coming down the aisle of the New York delegation, because I recognized I've walked this so many times, this aisle. I recognized Senator Hatch's sneakers in the back of Governor Walker's head, and he's coming down that aisle. I said, John, film the Jumbotron. And he said, no, we don't have to, because we get the full feed at the end of the night. You have one network that feeds it to everyone else, and they're going to get all of this. He said, let's do the original reporting here. I said, you never know what we're going to get. Film the Jumbotron, because he's coming up to the New York delegation, and it's important to get this picture. And so we're watching on the Jumbotron, and John's filming it, and Mitt Romney is shaking people's hands, and he comes to New York, and there is David Koch standing tall, and he shakes his hand, he puts his arm on him, he points at him, and he walks on. I mean, this isn't that surprising. He is shaking many people's hands. He is a major, major donor. But it's important to have that image when we talk about their relationship. And then he moves on, and he comes up, and he gives a speech. And at the end of the night, we call Robbie Karen, our video producer, who's here with us tonight in New York, and we say, hey, Robbie, pull the video of the Romney-Koch handshake. And he said, no, there is no Koch-Romney handshake. We said, what are you talking about? No, look, when they're walking down the aisle, when Mitt Romney, and he goes and he shakes, maybe you don't recognize David Koch. He hasn't been a public figure for that long. He did a lot of things behind the scenes. He said, no, I recognize him, and there's no image there of this. I said, did they not send him walking down the aisle? He said, no, they sent him walking down the aisle. He's shaking people's hands. He comes to the New York delegation, but then it cuts away. You have two young women, very energetic, with red, white, and blue feather boas, and then it shows a big full screen of the floor, and then it comes right back to him shaking hands just beyond David Koch as he walks down the aisle. Very interesting. And so Robbie sent through the internet the video that the rest of the world saw. And we took the video that we had filmed of the Jumbotron, what actually happened on the floor, and we did a split screen the next day. And if you watch Democracy Now!, you would be the ones to see what actually happened. And then all of the networks picked up the Koch-Romney handshake. We call that trickle-up journalism. Story. The day before the convention, I went to a talk with Michael Pranish in Tampa. He is a Boston Globe reporter who wrote the biography of Mitt Romney. And he told the story of Mitt Romney's father, Governor George Romney, very popular Michigan governor, who after even just 2 years, people wanted him to run for president against Barry Goldwater. This was 1964. And Governor Romney waited, he consulted his son Mitt in high school and his wife, and then he went to the Republican convention and took Mitt with him. And he decided not to run, but he despised Barry Goldwater. And he gave a speech before the Republican Platform Committee. He despised that he wouldn't support civil rights, he wouldn't support the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, and he gave this speech and warned the Republican Party against extremism and hate. And he said, this is what will destroy our party. And he particularly singled out the John Birch Society, that segregationist, racist organization that fought Dr. King and civil rights organizations. It was founded actually in Appleton, Wisconsin, and it's still there today. It was co-founded by Charles and David Koch's father, Fred Koch. And I just thought it was interesting that today you have the sons of the founder of the John Birch Society shaking hands with funding, fully supporting the son of Governor Romney, who had warned against the hate and extremism. Just an interesting fact. And we'll then move on to the Democratic Convention. First day in Charlotte, it was pouring. And I got a text. It said there was going to be some kind of action right outside the Democratic Convention when it was being gavelled in inside. And so we went to a corner and we saw this bus pulling up that had all these butterflies painted on it. And it was called the Undocu bus. And many people got out of this bus. They had taken the bus from Phoenix to Charlotte. undocumented immigrants, inspired by the young dreamers, the young people in high school and in college, who perhaps don't even know the country they were born in, came here when they were 6 months or a year old, and always faced the threat of deportation. And they were sitting in President Obama's campaign offices and other Congress members and senators' offices. And, you know, this was humiliating to President Obama. I mean, he was a community organizer. I mean, Charlotte, for example, has such a rich civil rights history. Remember, in 1960, the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins at Woolworths inspired the students at the historically black college, Johnson C. Smith College in Charlotte, and they marched on the Charlotte lunch counters to integrate them. Great civil rights history. And the Dreamer movement is the modern-day civil rights movement. And so President Obama did concede this summer and issued a kind of executive order that said young people, young undocumented immigrants, 30 or under, if they met certain criteria, they could get a reprieve of deportation for 2 years, they could work here legally, they could go to school here legally. Okay, they couldn't have health insurance, but they could do those other things. But that wasn't enough for them, though it was a tremendous victory. I mean, they risk so much. They don't just risk arrest, they risk deportation when they do these civil disobediences, but they kept on. And now their families came with them in the bus, their mothers and their fathers. And they got out on this corner in Charlotte. And I had interviewed Rosie Carrasco that morning on March Now. Always interesting to watch March Now and see what people do who were on the show. So Rosie Carrasco was one of the first ones out of the bus, and she's very energetic. As they came out of the bus, they were chanting, "No papers, no fear, no papers, no fear." And so I'm talking to her about why she's there, and a guy came up who, he's a well-known media personality. It's hard to call them journalists, so he's a well-known media personality, and he came up to me, and I had been on panels with him, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And, you know, he was just going into the convention. And I said, "Well, it looks like these people are about to get arrested." He said, "What do they want?" So I said, "Well, I was just interviewing Rosie Carrasco. She was right in front of us." So I said, "Well, why don't you ask her?" And he said, "No, just tell me." So I said, "Rosie, why don't you tell us gentlemen what it is you want?" And she said, "I want to know what kind of legacy President Obama wants to leave. I want to know if he wants to be remembered as the president who deported more immigrants than any president in U.S. history, or whether he wants to be remembered as the president on the side of the immigrants." Pretty eloquent. And he takes out his notebook and he starts to write down, why is it so difficult for them to talk to people at the heart of the story, at the target end of policy? This small circle of pundits we see on all the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. And Rosie's husband got out of the bus too. His name was Martin Nzweta. He was going to get arrested as well. And he said, "I've paid tax in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say." And they were getting arrested with their daughter. So they start marching all together. And there's this one young woman who's got her arm wrapped around this older woman, much smaller, her mother. And she won't let go of her. And they are marching, and they make their way to the front of the convention, right to the gates of the Democratic Convention. They unfurl this big banner with a big butterfly on it. And as they sat down on the banner, I said to her, "You know, excuse me, but you look like you might qualify for President Obama's executive order, that you could probably say." And she said, "I can, but my mother can't. And if she's deported, I might as well go with her." And then another young woman kneeled on the banner as the police were pouring in. And I said to her, "Why the butterflies, you know, on the bus, on the banner?" And she said, "Because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." And with that, the whole group of them got arrested by the police. These are the movements that make this country great. Now, one thing I want to talk about is my concern about the growing militarization of police in this country. It's something we must not get used to. The crackdown on dissent is extremely alarming. You know, after 9/11, Billions of dollars have gone into local police departments. They are buying tanks. They are buying drones. We have a law in America that says, it's called the Posse Comitatus Act. And it says that soldiers shouldn't march through the streets of the United States. And I think most people think that's a good thing. And the way the authorities are getting around this is by militarizing the police. We're not even talking about riot police anymore. We're talking about almost, well, soldier-like police. What is this for? The level of surveillance is unprecedented. The AP just did this pioneering series, for which they won the Pulitzer Prize this past year, that looked at one police department, the New York Police Department. And they looked at the thousands of people that they have been surveilling since 9/11, working with the Central Intelligence Agency, Arab Americans and Muslims, law-abiding citizens of this country. They're doing what they call mosque crawling. They are going beyond New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. The president of Yale University issued a statement saying, how dare you come to our state and surveil our students? In New Jersey officials expressed the same alarm. One of the ways this was discovered was a New Jersey landlord found all the surveillance equipment in one of his apartments, and he got alarmed and he called the police, but it was the police. We had a student of Democracy Now!, a CUNY student, City University of New York. He was named in the police documents under the Freedom of Information Act that AP had gotten. And his parents didn't want him to come on Democracy Now! They said, you don't want to get us targeted. And he said, we're already targeted. I'm already named. My only defense is if I speak out. And they, in their report, had all of the details of a weekend he spent camping with his friends. Apparently one of the people was an infiltrator. And every moment of their camping trip was in the New York Police Department records. And it said these students were so extreme that they prayed 4 times a day. He said this infiltrator was so stupid he didn't know we prayed 5 times a day. But it's extremely serious, and it doesn't increase our national security. I was invited on a network to talk about this, and the reporter said, you know, we like it or not, look at what happened September 11th, and look at other threats that have happened, and we just have to do this kind of thing. And I said, really? That's fine if we have a uniform standard of justice that we apply. For example, after Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City Federal Building, and after he was convicted, did police departments around the country monitor and surveil all white Christian communities in the United States? Hardly. That does not further law and order. You go for the criminals and you investigate, you try, and if they are found guilty, they should be punished. It actually has the opposite effect, because when communities feel under siege, they withdraw. And when they have a problem, when they see something that's not right, they're hardly going to go to the authorities that they feel persecuted by. That's why it's so important that we really keep this in check. And then you look at how the police have dealt with protest. Well, before we talk about that, I want to talk about the movements in this country. Because this last year, what a year of movements. I mean, you had first Tunisia, the people rise up because of a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi who came out of a university, found no opportunity, goes into the marketplace to sell fruit and vegetables, and he's being harassed by authorities. They steal his scale, and he just is so frustrated, he sets himself on fire. And that sparks the frustration of a generation, of a nation. And there was something else, I think, that sparked the Tunisian revolution, and that was WikiLeaks. Why WikiLeaks, the whistleblower website? Well, so many millions of documents had been released. State Department documents, Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs, And these are so important in times when governments crack down. You have to get information somehow. And these documents were written by soldiers in the field, first eyewitness. And I just want to talk about one of these series of documents, why they're so important. In February of 2007, and this came out from WikiLeaks in Iraq, there was an Apache helicopter that was hovering over an area, and 2 Iraqi men put up their hands in a surrender sign. And the soldiers in the helicopter called back to base, and they said, what do we do? These guys are trying to surrender. And the lawyer at the base told them, they weren't rogue, they were asking for instructions, said you can't surrender to the helicopter. So they blew these 2 Iraqis away. Now, this is why it is so important. If we knew this at the time, I think there would have been an investigation, there would have been an outcry, and something would have been done, which would have meant that 6 months later, the same Apache helicopter unit would not have been flying over Baghdad as it had been, an area called New Baghdad. Looking down, it was July 12, 2007, and they saw a group of men below. 2 of the men were Reuters employees. They were Namir Noor Eldin, an up-and-coming 22-year-old videographer, and his driver, Saeed Shema. He was 40. He was a father of 4. And drivers for news organizations in times of war, they're not just drivers, they're fixers. They're introducing reporters who parachute in for a few minutes. They're introducing them to the landscape. He was beloved by the Reuters community. And they had come to this area because it had been bombed the day before, and the men wanted to show these 2 Reuters employees around, the journalist and the driver. And here comes the Apache helicopter unit. And the video in the unit, the video in the Apache helicopter is what WikiLeaks released. You hear the soldiers laughing and cursing. And they call back to base. They're not alone, they're not doing this on their own. And they ask for permission to open fire, which they get. And they blow away all these guys below. Saeed did not get killed. He was critically wounded. He was dragging himself away, and a white van from the community came up with 2 children as well. And the Apache helicopter unit exploded them all, killing Saeed and people in the van as critically wounding the 2 children. And I dare say, if we had known what happened in February, and there would have been an investigation, that perhaps Namir Noor Eldin and Saeed Shema and these men who were taking them around their neighborhood